I'm delighted to welcome you to the RCSI Foley Lecture Series. This is a biannual programme of lectures delivered by distinguished national and international speakers. Its aim being to enrich college, its life and its community. The lecture series is named after, it comes through a generous donation from an RCSI Canadian alumnus, Dr. Michael Foley, who's a 1950 RCSI graduate who actually practiced and was from Carlow, practiced in Carlow for a short time, immigrated to Canada with his wife Nuala in the 1960s. The aim of the Foley Lecture is designed between Dr. Foley and ourselves is really to introduce ideas of note for evolving international medical and health professional audience from speakers from outside the traditional medical and scientific domain. Our speaker in 2013 was Michael Carey, founder of the Company of Food and chairman of board BIA, and his lecture at that time was Lessons from Industry in Going Global, very apt for an international organisation like RCSI. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Foley Lecture Series and to introduce our Dean, Professor Hannah McGee, to introduce the 2015 speaker.
Good evening, everybody. President, Vice President, Chief Executive, Chancellor and Registrars of the NUI, and Declan's colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs, DIT President, and friends, colleagues and guests. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Declan Kelly, our former Irish Ambassador to Malaysia. Mr. Kelly, and I think I'll call him Declan because he didn't stand on formality in his former role, so I know he likes to be informal, has held a number of ambassadorial positions for Ireland and has represented Ireland internationally for more than 3 decades. Prior to his most recent appointment as Irish Ambassador to Malaysia and Thailand, he served terms as the Irish Ambassador to Canada, Australia, I'm creating new continents here, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Fiji, an interesting passport. And from 1985 to 1990 he was posted to Ottawa as the first Secretary in Charge d'Affaires of the Irish Embassy in Canada. And he was delighted, I understand, to return there in 2006. From 2006 to 2010, he was Ambassador in Canada. And it's therefore very fitting in a way that he should be delivering the Foley Lecture, which is sponsored by Carl Mann and an Irish alumnus now living in Vancouver. I know Declan said he spent many holidays in Canada, including driving across from Ottawa to the Rockies, and visited Prince Edward Island, Vancouver, and Vancouver Island. So Dr. Foley was interested to know how close he was in a way to where he lived. In 2010, the Toronto Irish community in Canada voted Declan as the Irish Person of the Year in recognition of the contribution that the embassy made to the Irish community there. The presentation was made at a lunch attended by over 400 people, in which the singer Colin Wilkinson, a friend of Declan's for many years, made a special appearance. We don't have any scheduled singers this evening, but if anybody wants to volunteer afterwards, you're very welcome. But more recently, and in another continent, Declan has been a great support to us as an Irish academic community in his term in Malaysia. We as RCSI have been greatly supported in Penang Medical College, jointly with our colleagues in UCD, and we welcome our colleagues here this evening from UCD. This is a college which is almost 20 years in existence, and it's been greatly served by our ambassadors, particularly for Declan in the last number of years. We've also been greatly served in Perdana University, a new venture established in 2011 during Declan's term as ambassador there. Declan is a great man to provide wise counsel, and he has a capacity to connect and interact and interpret a culture that's very different to us. And that's hugely important when you're an Irish person abroad. And he and Anne are spectacular hosts in everything that they do when we're there. So we've always been very grateful for both the wise words, the interpretation and the hosting. And it's very clear that they're also hugely admired by many of the senior civil servants in Malaysia. We've been told that up close. And it's inspiring to see the face of Irish diplomacy abroad as exemplified by Declan through their work in recent years. It's something that most Irish people don't get much of a chance to see when you're in Ireland, just how our diplomatic service work abroad. The aim of the Foley Lecture is to enrich our campus and our community through a series of lectures featuring eminent individuals in business, health sciences, arts, social or political activities, as Cathal has said. And Declan has amassed a unique experience and an understanding of Irish higher education activities abroad through his diplomatic career in different countries and continents. And so we feel he is a very fitting candidate for the lecture and the medal as envisaged by Dr. Foley in his sponsorship. And we look forward to learning from Declan this evening from his reflections on Irish higher education in the international arena. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Declan Kelly, former Irish Ambassador to Malaysia, to deliver the second Foley Lecture entitled Foreign Policy is Domestic Policy, How the Embassy Network Assists Exporters, including the education sector, to operate abroad. Declan.
Thanks very much indeed, Hannah. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. I'm delighted that you mentioned Anne, who's here tonight, because we hear a lot these days about being competitive, etc., etc. And the message I always deliver to visiting politicians is that the Irish ambassadors were a bit like the sales these days: buy one, get one free. And the wives are an indispensable part of our operation. So it's a great honour to be here this evening to deliver the Foley Lecture. But I also feel that Anne should share in the honour, because I could not have done the job which I've done for the last 4 decades without her help and assistance. And I have to tell you, when it comes to receptions in the Irish Embassy, she was the star, not me, the boring guy in the suit. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland for inviting me to deliver this year's Foley Lecture, the second in the series. When Cathal extended the invitation to me, he asked me to talk about ways in which education providers, as the title says, can learn from my experience of being part of an organisation which has extended its influence and developed globally. Most of this evening's lecture will be based on my own experiences in the department, both at home and abroad. I've also been guided by the excellent policy document published in January by the department this year, called The Global Island, which details the department's plans going forward and explains in a very clear and concise way how, among other responsibilities, we assist exporters to consolidate their positions in markets and to find new ones. In doing that, we are part of a large ecosystem, of course, which encompasses, of course, the entrepreneurs and the risk takers, other government departments and state agencies. The Global Island document captures this very succinctly in the phrase that the department's work from now on, nothing is entirely foreign or wholly domestic when it comes to the work of the department. I retired in June of this year after 42 years service. Sounds really horrendous, by the way. 24 abroad, and the balance at home with 3.5 years in the department of the Taxation. My first ambassadorial appointment was in 2003 as ambassador to Australia, New Zealand and Fiji, based in Canberra. I thought I'd sort of mention this because sometimes people take things, I guess, for granted, but it is a tremendous honour to represent the country and wear the green jersey, which is, I guess, is very topical at the moment. And I'll always remember the day I presented my credentials to the Governor-General. It was a cold morning in July in Australia in 2003. Of course, it's the winter in the southern hemisphere. And when I exited the building, the band struck up the Irish national anthem. And the Irish flag then was raised to the top of the pole. And I remember standing there, and it was a very emotional moment, and a lot of things went through my head very quickly, not least being thinking of how some of my ancestors had arrived in Australia in far less congenial circumstances. Being your country's representative abroad also places great responsibility on your shoulders. I was always very conscious of this when I spoke with people who had little or no knowledge of Ireland. So the fact that I would meet them meant that their view of my country would be based very much on how I reacted to them. So I was always very careful about how I spoke to people, especially those who knew nothing about Ireland. It's a very humbling experience, in a sense, to be the Irish ambassador abroad, because you realise that in the great scheme of things, much and all as we are a wonderful country, basically we are very small. And I learned very quickly, and this is the first lesson I guess I would pass on to people, is never take anything for granted when talking about Ireland. I found this out the hard way in my first posting when I was Consul General in San Francisco. and I had to speak to a local Rotary club. And the subject was Northern Ireland. It's funny how some things never change. 40 years later, it's still Northern Ireland. Anyway, I was full of enthusiasm, having been involved in some of the stuff in the leading up to the 1985 not Good Friday Agreement, the agreement in 85. Anyway, I launched into this speech, and I knew after about 10 minutes, this is going down like a lead balloon. So I quickly switched gears and decided that what I'll do is I'll end up and I'll invite questions. So I will always remember to this day, and in fact this guy did me a great favour. He stood up and he said, "Mr. Council, could I ask you, how does it feel for you, an Irishman, when every day you go down to Dublin town and you see British soldiers on the street?" Well, I said, I really couldn't tell you because the last one left in 1922. Anyway, the point there was that never underestimate people's knowledge. I don't say that in any smart way, but it was me who learned the lesson because I had made assumptions about this man. And he told me afterwards that he'd been in Belfast. And, you know, it would have taken a lunch and a dinner to explain all the history to him. But it was a very good lesson for me. I made it my business in all my postings to engage with and work closely with the Irish community, and it was a very satisfying part of the job. I can honestly say that I was never disappointed when I asked for help from the community, whether it was to gather information for an Irish exporter, help a citizen in trouble, or give a dig out to the embassy when hosting ministers or other VIPs. The lesson here is very simple. Work with the local Irish community. If you are an exporter, if you're exporting goods or services, they are an invaluable source of willing assistance and advice. I was never disappointed. I also made sure in all my postings to develop good working relations with the state agencies who were in the country. I never stood on ceremonies. Anybody who knows me knows that I never did. It's not in my nature when it came to sharing information on contacts. Now, this may seem like a fairly straightforward thing, but believe you me, it's not easy to achieve. It can be difficult because of the competitive nature of the work environment and the understandable tendency of organisations to protect their own turf. But if you can get it to happen, my experience was things will work a heck of a lot better. The Irish ability to network and communicate is a great asset, and while I don't wish to sound chauvinistic, over 2 decades working outside the country has convinced me that we are in the gold medal category when it comes to connect with people. It really is an extraordinary gift. And I say that having attended too many meetings that I want to talk about involving European Union ambassadors, and at times I had a pain in my ear listening to the conversation which never came from the guy on my right and the guy on my left. It always seemed to be the Irish representative who had the ability to say something to make a connection. And this really is a great gift. But again, it's something which we take for granted, but it is really a tremendous asset. So getting people to work together, networking, identifying key people in my host countries, especially those who are influential in the bureaucracy or political system, is something I enjoy doing. If you allow me to go back for a little while, the reason I think I evolved like this is that I never, despite 4 decades in it, I have never regarded myself as a bureaucrat. And I think the reason for that is that by the grace of God, and a bit like Forrest Gump when you got the box of chocolates, you didn't know what was going to happen, I spent the first 12 years in the civil service as private secretary to either Brian Lenihan, John Kelly, David Andrews, Gareth Fitzgerald, and briefly Jerry Collins. I actually was appointed, on the day I was appointed, I was assigned to the Minister's office in 1973. The Minister was then the late Brian Lenihan. So within a matter of a few weeks, but the way things were in 1973, there was a new government and Dr. Gareth Fitzgerald was appointed Minister, and I found myself working for a new man. One of my jobs was to arrange and look after his travel arrangements. Gareth caused a minor panic in the department when he asked me to get a hold of a copy of the World ABC Airways Guide and the Cook's train timetable. I remember I innocently went down to the accountant at the time and he says, "What the hell is that? I never heard of it." Anyway, I had enough gumption not to go back up and tell Gareth that. We eventually found a copy. So within a matter of weeks, I was an expert on working out FCUs, which of course we all know are fare construction units in figuring the price of airline travel. But it was a great time. It's great being 22. It was a case of ignorance is bliss. I didn't realise that the guy across the table had been the scheduled manager in Aer Lingus. But as I say, you're fearless when you're 22. John Kelly, who's also passed away, was given responsibility for certain aspects of Ireland's new overseas aid policy, and I was appointed his private sec while staying in Garrett's office. In 1977, Fianna Fáil came to power, and then I was appointed private secretary to David Andrews. So you see perfect political credentials on all sides. In July 1981, a new government came to power with Gareth Fitzgerald as Taoiseach, and at his request, I was seconded to the Taoiseach's department as his private secretary. In March 1982, the minister at the time put 18% tax on children's shoes, and I found myself sitting in a car with Garrett and the late Dermot Nally heading to the Áras to hand in the resignation. I returned briefly to the department as private secretary to Jerry Collins. I say briefly because in November that year, following the extraordinary incidents in the park and MacArthur and the Attorney General's apartment, etc., there was an election and I was back over in the Taoiseach's department. Now, the reason I say all of that is I was like some kind of a wandering minstrel private secretary, bouncing between all these people. But actually, it was a remarkable start to anybody's career, and I don't mean that in any boastful way, but because I was in all of these jobs, working closely with all these people, all of them very different in their own ways, I always took a big picture view of things. When you're in the private office, you have a great overview of how the department works. And when I was in the Taoiseach's department, you got a brilliant overview of how the rest of the civil service worked. I also became a very good networker, which stood to me in later life. As an ambassador, networking is an absolutely key and fundamental part of your job. As one of my bosses said to me, if you're sitting at the desk in the office in the embassy, you're not doing the job because you need to be out knocking on doors. So after that extraordinary sort of bizarre, in many ways, start, I was off and running. It's a great department to have been a part of. I won't go into the history of it now, but it's one of the oldest departments in the state, founded in 1919. And we've always been centrally involved in the work of the state. In the early days, when the state was founded in the 20s, obviously our job was to explain the new state to the world. During the Second World War, we played a crucial role in maintaining military neutrality. Joining the UN in the 50s and the 60s, the trend towards negotiating trade agreements was underway. And then, as the story of our entry to the then EEC began to emerge, we were one of the lead departments. We've always been involved in seeking solution to the situation in Northern Ireland. Indeed, we are again trying to put things back together. And then in more recent times, with the advent of cheaper access to international air travel, the department is increasingly called upon to assist Irish citizens in distress as a result of man-made or natural disasters. And we saw that there recently in San Francisco, where the consulate, the embassy, and the people back in consular section were deeply involved in the tragedy that happened in Berkeley. Finally, in the wake of the global financial crisis, the department at HQ and through our network of embassies and consulates worked with home departments to rebuild our international financial reputation and assist the government to restore our creditworthiness with overseas investors. To carry out all of these and many other obligations, the department has a staff of about 1,300 at home and abroad, which is fairly modest actually in terms of other countries, say like Finland and Denmark. And we have 80 embassies and consulates. As I say, it is a modest size, and we have a multinational staff who operate in over 40 languages. They are the other unsung heroes, by the way, of the Department of Foreign Affairs, are the local staff, some of whom have been with us for years and are a brilliant source of information for the new ambassadors, because we go in and out like a revolving door. So the first thing you always do is check with the local staff to find out where the local bodies are buried, who's in, who's out, who's up and who's down. And it's a very foolish ambassador who doesn't listen very carefully to them. Despite what Joe Duffy might say in the afternoons, most of our embassies are small and we don't sit around drinking champagne dressed in white tie and tails. When I was in Malaysia, we had a joint staff of 2 diplomats, myself and a deputy, and in Canada and Australia there was a total of 3 in the embassy, myself and 2 staff plus the locals. And of course, since 2009, the department has reduced in overall numbers by 15%. So, if you like, that's the background and giving you maybe some sense of what it's like. So on the supporting exports and helping our businesses to operate abroad, we are operating today, as if we all didn't know this, in a period of extraordinary volatility. As I did research for this, for the lecture, it was interesting to note how quickly certain events of far-reaching economic and political significance appear to be heading in a certain direction, only to have an entirely different outcome in a relatively short space of time. Take, for example, in the middle of the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, all the talk then was of the decline of the United States and Europe. Remember that? The rise of China, the rise of the BRIC, Turkey. They were on the move, watching Bloomberg and all these programs, CNBC, we were finished. Europe was gone, the euro was gone, the United States was finished. It's a very different story today, just 5 years later. Brazil is experiencing negative growth, and the jewel and crown of its economy, the oil industry, is being battered by the collapse of oil prices and the effects of a massive corruption scandal. Russia had suffered a similar fate, again because of the collapse of oil prices and the impact of sanctions imposed by the West following its invasion of Crimea and incursions into eastern Ukraine. This year has also seen an end for now of the period of high economic growth in China. The extraordinary volatility of the Shanghai stock market in recent weeks and the very uncertain way in which the Chinese government tried to deal with this has made many foreign investors wary. So you're an Irish exporter of goods or services, be it whatever, including education. You'll be watching anxiously to see how China, this huge market, responds to this challenge of moving to a different economic model which does not depend on massive public investment for future growth. India, among the BRIC, has actually recorded decent growth levels in recent years. On the political front, if you think of these things, and these are situations that are not going to change going forward. In 2011 in Tunisia, the series of political demonstrations which became referred to or known as the Arab Spring looked like they might signal the beginning of a much needed change for the better in several Middle East countries. Regrettably, as we now know, that has not been the case, and the region is now engulfed in violent political, religious, social and economic upheaval, turning the hopes engendered by the demonstrations into a nightmare for millions of people, which we see playing out nightly on our screens. In tandem with these geopolitical economic changes, most of our lives have been impacted to a greater or lesser extent by advances in technology in the last decade. I was reading a very good column earlier this year by Tom Friedman, the noted New York Times columnist, and he described this very well. He made the point that at the time of writing, I should say, given the changes in the Chinese stock market, 3 of the world's biggest companies by market capitalization were Uber, a taxi company which owns no cabs, Airbnb, a provider of accommodation which owns no property, and in China, Jack Ma's Alibaba, a giant trading platform which actually owns no goods but just has them for sale. So in such a world, clearly it's very difficult for our exporters to know, should you move into that country, should you not? So I think going forward, it'll be increasingly important for the Department of Foreign Affairs and the trade side, working with Enterprise Ireland, working with the Home Departments. I mean, I'm not saying they will have a crystal ball or will be able to solve the problems, but we need to be on the ball to give as much information as we can back to the home governments about these rapid changes that are taking place, so people will have some sense of developing trends. A point I'd like to make as well is that, again, people often think of the Department of Foreign Affairs and ivory towers and all the rest of it, but we work very closely, despite personality traits and things that happen from time to time. We work very closely with other government departments, and we work with them on all kinds of legislation which is vital in order to make sure that our exporters are able to operate. For example, we work with the Departments of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation on making sure we have a robust international trade framework. We work with the revenue commissioners on double taxation agreements. And recently, we've been working very closely with the Department of Finance dealing with matters of international taxation, which of course are absolutely crucial for us. So, many years ago you wouldn't have thought of the Department of Finance and international taxation, but we really need to know what's going on behind the scenes, who's making the moves, where's the pressure coming from, because in the end of the day, these tax levels are absolutely crucial for foreign direct investment for us. So we are part of a very powerful ecosystem on that front. We also work closely with the Department of Transport and Tourism on negotiations concerning new air routes and tourism promotion. And we work with the Department of Justice and Equality to ensure we have a visa system which is efficient. And that again is very important for business, because people want to send people from, say, India, China, whatever, to our country. We need to make sure there's a very smooth visa system in operation. We also work with all these other departments to develop new markets. Our exports are performing well at the moment, but we absolutely cannot rest on our laurels. Our traditional markets in the United States, Britain, Australia, Canada, where we're well known, we're doing well there, and our exporters understand these markets. But the growth in the future is going to come in the emerging markets. The UN estimates that the population of the world, it's a scary figure, will reach 8.5 billion by 2030, some 7 billion of whom will live in these markets. Therefore, in addition to, as I say, the traditional markets, we need to be active in these areas. An important point to note about the latter is that in many countries, and this is an important one for the department, the state is a big player in the economy, so they want to operate on a government-to-government basis. That was part of the reasoning behind the government's decision last year to open embassies in Indonesia, Thailand, Kenya, and consulates in trade centres of Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, and Austin, Texas. I covered Malaysia and Thailand, so I was non-resident ambassador in Thailand. And I have to tell you that when you're a non-resident ambassador, it's a very tough hill to climb. Because when I used to go in and meet senior officials in Thailand, the first thing they would ask me inevitably was, why are you based in Malaysia, not in Thailand? Now, there are reasons for this, which I'm not going to go into tonight. But it is very difficult to actually get a feel for a country if you're not based in it. And that goes back again to my earlier training. Want to know something that's happening in Dublin, turn up in Doherty and Nesbitt's, don't mind the Irish Times. And again, when you're not based in Thailand, you can't find out really what's happening. You listen to officials, you know you're getting the party line, but you don't really know what's happening. So you've got to be located in the country. Africa is home to 6 of the top 10 fastest growing world economies. Our trade with Africa is increasing, especially in the area of ICT, financial services, and telecommunications. So I mentioned China earlier, and one of the things, I retired in June, one of the things I've been able to do is I like getting up early in the morning and giving Anne some peace to rest on after I bring her up her breakfast in bed. And I sit and I watch Bloomberg and CNBC. And I love watching these programs. And it's fascinating listening to people talking about China and what's going to happen. But I knew several people in Malaysia who knew the Chinese market very well. And one man in particular, a very, very interesting man who went to Blackrock College here in Dublin, he's now in his 80s. He's Chinese Malaysian. He just said, look, China will continue to go forward on and on. There will be ups and downs, there will be setbacks. But he said, one thing that's absolutely certain is these guys will get it right. The figures are absolutely staggering. The number of people they've already taken out of poverty. They're in a transition at the moment, which is due to the fact that the model of state spending, et cetera, that's tapped out. They now have to make the next switch. But these guys know what happened in Moscow. They're not going to make the same mistake. But, they are going to move forward. There will be rocky periods, but in the end of the day, it's going forward. So that is very much the situation in China. Ladies and gentlemen, as I say, down through the years, we've adapted to the situation, the department, as we needed to do. And I have to say, one of the most difficult periods that I ever had in the job was after the financial collapse in 2009 and 2010. And this underlines another point that behoves all of our exporters to bear in mind is, again, not taking things for granted. I was ambassador in Malaysia when things were really bad in 2008 and especially in 2009. And I found myself calling on people in the central bank there, calling on financial newspapers, stock exchange, whatever. And what really surprised me, and it shouldn't have because I spent a lot of time in Canada, was when I drilled into it, how little real knowledge they had of Ireland. I was trying to explain, and I don't mean this in any derogatory way, but that we were different than Greece and Portugal. Even though we were lumped in with the pigs, still gives me post-traumatic stress when I read that. And trying to explain the fundamentals of the Irish economy, and we had this massive base of FDI, ICT, fantastic pharmaceutical business, the other elements, financial services, etc. And that really was a shocker to me. And a lot of people said to me, look, Ambassador, you know, I'm Irish extraction, but I'm sorry, I should know more about Ireland, but I don't. So the point really was driven home to me is absolutely don't take anything for granted, not just in countries in the emerging markets, but in places where you might think, because they've been over and had a few pints of Guinness and did the tour, that they know all about us. They don't. That's just the reality. And again, when you think about it, why should they? It's a very small country, and that is the reality. On the same trail, when I was in Thailand, it was quite interesting. I called to see the Secretary General of the Thai Finance Ministry. And it was a fascinating meeting because he was educated in Britain. He spoke perfect English. And I was about to launch into my explanation. But this guy was very interesting because the first thing he said to me was, listen, Ambassador, we had a financial collapse in 1997. I was an assistant secretary in the finance ministry. In our case, it was due to a banking collapse because of a housing crisis. But he said, we're doing well today, and you will too. And I have to say, I felt like giving that guy a hug, although you don't do those things in Thailand, because it was the first bit of good news I'd had in weeks. And I used that, in fact. I made great use of that phrase later in the day as I spoke to other people and did the old Irish thing and turned around and sure, listen, it was like yourselves in 97, we'll be back as well. Well, I wasn't absolutely sure. As I said, we are small, we have limited resources, etc., etc., but we also have some very good competitive advantages. And one of them is, without doubt, the extraordinary ability around St. Patrick's Day to be able to open doors all over the world, from China, Moscow, and most extraordinarily in Washington, and everybody knows about it, so I won't go into it. But I can tell you one thing, it is the envy of all of our colleagues. I remember the German ambassador in Australia saying, what is all this? How can you get to see the President of the United States every year? And we have found it so difficult. I didn't like to tell him that we didn't invade anybody except the Fenians. Did try to invade Canada in 1867, but as usual, they made bags of it. But so, the reality was that, the reality is that it's an extraordinary thing. And I know there's a lot of cynicism in the newspapers back home, but it is an amazing thing. In Canada and Australia, all of the ministries, they already came on board. We could build a fantastic program around it. The IDA, EI, Tourism Ireland, we all benefited from this. So I have to say, the dear saint, God bless him, he's no idea the favour he did with us all those many years ago when he came over to bring Christianity to the Irish. And but it is an extraordinary thing. But we need to use those things. We need to use those things. And I saw close at hand how country with royalty made massive use of that royalty. For example, in Thailand, we had a very tough time making progress in Thailand. And the reason for that was the king spent his youth driving around Europe in his Maserati, no doubt, calling in on all the royal families, because the Thais have a very long-standing royal family. But I'm afraid our little republic out there on the western coast didn't feature. So I always found it very difficult in Thailand to make progress. And in fact, I remember one day after I thought I made a very decent presentation, the guy looked at me and said, "You speak very good English, Ambassador." And I said, yes, so do all the Irish people. And it was the only time in my life, Maurice, where I made a virtue out of the fact that between 1801 and 1922, we were actually part of the empire. So he was greatly impressed by that. But as I say, you have to use your advantages as best you can. And another fantastic advantage we have, as I say, I mentioned earlier on, is the diaspora. And they really can open so many doors. Cahill and Hannah and Michael will appreciate this. In Penang, where you have, of course, at Penang Medical College, a very modest St. Patrick's Day parade took place over the last 2 years. And I'm talking about very modest. But this year, the Chief Minister of Penang, an important person for us in many ways, attended the parade. And I managed to sit beside him for an hour. And then I thought I'd give the guy a break and say, Minister, you really don't have to if you'd like to go off. No, he insisted on staying for the fish and chips. But I got 2 hours with him, again, directly related back. And I got 2 hours, impossible to get 2 hours with him in his office. But I was able to get it with him in a very relaxed way. And, he went away saying, listen, Ambassador, anything you need to do, give me a call, whatever. So I'm sort of going down to the granular level, if you like, of how things work. Because in the end of the day, you can write all the fancy policy papers you like, but what I found over the 4 decades, and especially when I was abroad, absolutely crucial thing at the end of the day was connections. You could have all the ideas in your head, whatever, but if you couldn't get that across, if you couldn't connect with the right people, well then it didn't matter for anything. And one of the best things that we've been able to do in recent years, and again, I'm not party political, I'm an employee of the state, I was an employee of the state, but presidential visits in the last 10 years have been absolutely phenomenal. I know President Higgins' visit to UK played huge here, but when I was ambassador in Australia, President McAleese visited 4 cities in 8 days, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne. And it is just hard to quantify the impact that had on Ireland. It was just extraordinary. We put a huge amount of effort into it. The then Chief of Protocol, Brian Nason, probably known to some people here. We spent weeks preparing the ground. And what that does is it sensitizes the bureaucracy to the fact that this is happening. So you get all of that wash. So all of the departments are aware that the Irish president is coming. And then, we had a reception in each of the cities, 4 cities in 8 days, 600 people at each reception. I have to tell you, it's the best weight loss program I was ever involved in. She also insisted on shaking everybody's hand. So you might say, well, why am I saying this? Again, I'm saying this because people don't really understand, and there's so much cynicism back here. It's one of the things I noticed after being away for 13 years. I think we're just a tad too cynical, and I better be careful not to mount any soapbox here. But the fact of the matter is that this visit had an enormous impact. For weeks and months afterwards, I had tons of cards, and the trick was to follow up with people immediately and get them with the aura of the visit still fresh in their minds. And it opened many, many doors. And in one case, and I can't reveal who this is, but we were trying to get to a particular guy for years about a high-tech export contract. And he rang me and asked me to have a game of golf with him. And basically said to me on the first tee, start talking, I'll be walking. He didn't want to engage with me because in case there was any favoritism, but he allowed me to say it. That was directly related to the president's visit. So, as I say, in the end of the day, it's these little moments, these little gems of contacts that happen that really make things. The same president came, and in fact, I'm delighted to see him here this evening, is President McAleese came to Canada, another real highlight of my career abroad in terms of when she opened the Famine Memorial in Toronto, and Robert is with us here this evening. It was an amazing day. Again, the impact on the people that she made in Canada was absolutely unquantifiable. It was an amazing day again for the diaspora, because on the Canadian side was the late Jim Flaherty, Minister for Finance, who was a very good friend of mine, and he died all too suddenly last year. But he had persuaded Stephen Harper, a well-known Anglophile who wouldn't be a great friend of Republics, to part with $500,000 towards the funding of the memorial. But only for Robert's extraordinary work, it would never have got off the ground in the first place. By the way, I was just, this is only a thought that's not directly connected, but in 1847, and Robert, I'm sure, will correct me on the figures, but Toronto had a population, I think, of 20-odd thousand, and literally twice that number of refugees passed through on their way to the United States and other parts of Western Canada. So, in other words, some things never change as we're confronted with our TV pictures every evening. So I suppose in many ways it's no surprise that the Irish ambassador in Australia and Canada is able to count on support from the diaspora, but this was also the case in Malaysia. And again, I'd just like to mention 3 people. And again, I'm going down to the granular level because this is where it really happens. We have there a nun, and I think some of the staff in RCSI will know Sister Enda Ryan, originally from Limerick, 86 years of age, right? So Sister Enda went out there in the middle of the Malaysian insurgency, and she set up what today is one of the top secondary schools in Malaysia. She's a remarkable woman. She's still hale and hearty, absolutely wonderful. But why is she connected with the governor of the Central Bank of Malaysia? Well, one of the people I wanted to get to see when we were really having a very difficult time was the governor of the Central Bank, but it wasn't that easy to actually get to see her. And I bumped into her one evening, and I mentioned to her that her former headmistress, Sister Enda Ryan, was asking for her. That immediately grabbed her attention, and I had the appointment the next day. So that's how it works. That's really how it works. So again, I was, if you like, as Mary McAleese used to say, resting on the shoulders of giants, because I was able to use that diaspora connection to open a door for me that wasn't that easy to open. Last year, Richard Bruton visited Malaysia, and again, she generally only met with prime ministers or finance ministers, but at my request, she met with him and gave the full treatment, meeting with him in the governor's room in the Bank Negara, the Central Bank of Malaysia. Another extraordinary man was Brother Felix. Again, Brother Felix Donoghue, originally from Laois. I was invited to his 80th birthday party where 500 Malaysians, Christians, Muslims and Hindus, one after the other got up, not the entire 500, but about 20 of them, to talk about the extraordinary impact this man had on their lives. And at that event, I met so many people that, again, I wouldn't have necessarily been able to connect with. It was quite extraordinary. I mentioned earlier this remarkable Chinese Malay man, Leslie Yu. Leslie went to the De La Salle brothers, an Irish teacher. He recommended Blackrock College back in the late 40s. Leslie came here, wealthy family. He then met this German lady whose father was setting up a little glass company called Waterford Glass, assisting with it. He was an expert blower from Germany. And Leslie then married her, went back to Malaysia rather, but to this day, he's an extraordinary friend of Ireland. He opened doors for me all over Malaysia, especially in the oil and gas industry, and we had an interest there at one occasion. He's now a member of the Global Irish Network. So this was an alumnus who never lost his love for Ireland. So what brought us all together here tonight was education. And while I was involved somewhat in education in Australia and Canada, it was nothing to the same extent as I have been in Malaysia. And the connection with Malaysia is very interesting. In many ways, the education defines the relationship between Ireland and Malaysia. Like within days of arriving, I was meeting, Malays, whatever, and they'd say, "Oh, Ireland, oh, my niece studies medicine in Ireland, my nephew, my auntie, my uncle, whatever." And I heard so much of this, I went in and Googled several hospitals in Malaysia and discovered, Irish qualifications everywhere. It was very reassuring, in fact, to know that should I need their services or ANS, that there was Irish qualified people all over Malaysia. The good news is I didn't need anybody, so far anyway. But it was an extraordinary connection. When I presented my credentials to the King in Malaysia, he's a very nice man. There were 6 people presenting that day: the American ambassador, the Irish ambassador, the British High Commissioner, the Ukrainian, and interestingly, the North and South Korean. We were just hoping that his staff hadn't mixed up the brief in relation to the latter. But when I went into him, and he was obviously under pressure, he said to me, "Oh, Ambassador, I don't know a lot about Ireland, but he said, I do know you have wonderful horses." And he said, "My horses are fed from Connolly's Mills food in, I think, Kilkenny." And I said, "Oh, it's very impressive." But he said, "I also know you have fantastic medical colleges, really wonderful." oh, that was 2 ups. I was wondering what the third one was. The third one was, he said, he really was impressed by Roy Keane. That was the second time in my life in Malaysia that Roy Keane had entered the conversation. I was once going home in a taxi after the embassy Rolls Royce was in the garage. That's only a joke, by the way. And just as we got to the residence, of course, the flag was there. The driver, who was an Indian guy, said, "Oh, it's the Irish flag." And I said, "Yes, no, it's not the Indian, no, it's the Irish flag. Ireland, are you the Irish ambassador?" I said, "I am." Roy Keane should never have been allowed to play after Saipan. And I tried to pay him for 10 minutes, but he wouldn't get out of the taxi. But anyway, or he wouldn't let me out of the taxi. But again, this is extraordinary. This is how you connect. It's not at the super high policy level. It's assumed you have all that right. But if you connect at the granular level, that's how you connect with people. So, as I say, education is a huge part. It's a huge business as well. In 2013-14 academic year, the HEA reckoned that we had just over 23,000 students enrolled in publicly funded institutions and the RCSI. And Enterprise Ireland have reckoned that the business is now worth in the region of 1 billion. I don't know how absolutely accurate that is, but it's worth several hundred million, that is for sure. About 9% of full-time students are international, a figure which is close to the EU average. And during my time in Malaysia, I did notice a significant increase in our competition. And what I mean by that is that when I went in 08, 09, 10, I went to some of the educational fairs, but towards the end of my posting, I noticed that the Australians, who have a huge presence there, but also the New Zealanders, the Canadians, but American universities, because just like ourselves, they were all suffering cutbacks to their third level institutions and universities. So the competition for us is hotting up. Foreign Affairs participates in a high level group of international education and coordinates national policy and initiatives. We also support international promotion of education in several specific ways. We support education-focused trade missions to the priority markets. We work with the universities and institutes of technology on individual partnerships. What we try to do, by the way, with the alumni is keep them interested in Ireland. That's a very important thing to do, but not easy. It's not easy to do. We also work with the decision makers on bilateral agreements, and we try to help getting access in countries where there are big scholarship programs to get access to them. Malaysians love memoranda of understanding. They absolutely love them. The Irish government is not that keen on them, but I did persuade the Department of Education that they had to step up to the plate, and in fairness, they did step up very well. I enjoyed working with the department. They were really wonderful. Malaysia hosts several education fairs each year. The Star Fair is a very popular one. And here I'm entering slightly dodgy territory because ambassadors are jacks of all trade but masters of none. But I know there was often debates among many of the institutions about the value of going to these. But you know, one thing I struck me as very important is that Irish ministers did attend that fair every year that I was there. And what I found very useful was showing the ministers, letting them see for themselves the scale of the opposition, the size of the Australian universities, the size of the New Zealand universities, the British Council, the whole operation. And that in itself, even if the particular institutions didn't actually garner any number of students on that particular occasion, it was an education in itself for the members of the government. And in fairness, any of the ministers of state, mostly who came out, always made that point to me, and sort of saying, my goodness, I had no idea the competition was so ferocious. So it was, as I say, very useful to do that. Again, coming out and back, it's a bit like being accredited on a secondary basis, but in the end of the day, there's nothing succeeds like being there, and that's why RCSI and UCD have such a brilliant reputation in Malaysia. RCSI, of course, is also involved in Perdana University because they're on the spot, they're on the ground, and there is no substitute for that. In 2012, EI began a pilot program whereby they set up a small office in a very big Chinese high school. The idea being that the kids could drop into this office. It was a very low-cost operation. They hired a local staff member there. And it was really fascinating to talk to these kids. I brought a couple of ministers out there, and we had a couple of wonderful sessions. I also attended their St. Patrick's Day events, including their attempts at Irish dancing. That's when the ambassador has to really maintain a poker face, and what one of my colleagues said to me, concerned silence, better not say anything. But Michael Flatley needn't be worried about the competition. That's not the point. The point was they were trying. They actually produced something which they told me was Irish stew. However, I ate it in great trepidation, and I was glad that I had a good VHI policy because I wasn't sure what was in it. Anyway, I did survive. I also enjoyed hosting events for visiting Irish universities and institutes of technology, and I absolutely learned an awful lot from these visits. Another tricky area, and this has had mixed results, but another tricky area to try and do business, some institutions went the partnership route. In itself, it is good, but the thing is, you really need to be very careful who you pick as your partners because things can go wrong. In Malaysia, again, as I say, even though on paper it's a capitalist country, the government plays a huge part in life. It's really a socialist country in that sense, and especially in education. And they have these two massive agencies called MARA, which of course I got a chuckle when I first read, and JPA. The amounts of money these people have at their disposal is quite extraordinary, and the amount of areas that they cover is amazing. So again, I spent a lot of my time going in and out of these places and getting to know the people involved. I do remember, and I learned again very quickly from this one, when I met the Minister for Education, Khalid Norden, who's now the Chief Minister of the State of Johor. I was only in the job a few weeks, and we had a very nice pleasantries. And I said to him, well, Minister, it's great that we have the Memorandum of Understanding, but of course the universities themselves are all in contact, and they don't really need us to be too involved. He looked at me and he said, Ambassador, I stay very closely involved in what's happening with the Memorandum of Understanding. So point was taken. I didn't put my foot in it again a second time. I made a brief mention of Alumni Associations, and this is a very tricky one because Malaysia, they're spread all over the place. They're up in Penang, they're in KL and Ipoh and all these places. But I found over the years that even though we didn't manage to get big numbers, any of the alumni that I met always had very, very warm memories of their time in Ireland and spoke really warmly about their professors, etc., etc. They loved coming to the embassies. They loved telling me about listening to the Dubliners, and they were into the Irish music, at times put me to shame. And I remember often thinking to myself, I know it's not easy to do, but I wish there was a better way that we could really magically find access to the alumni. And I'm absolutely convinced that having a function in the embassy is worth a lot. You can go to a hotel, whatever, but there's a magic for it in these people when they come to the embassy. They feel their bit in the back of the old saw type of thing. The very last function which myself and Anne attended, in fact, was the Malaysian Irish Alumni Association, held appropriately enough in the Guinness Anchor Berhad, special, basically they have this area, they manufacture Guinness in Malaysia, and they have a kind of a pub which can be hired out. So I thought this was slightly Monty Python-esque, as here was my last official speech being made to all these Malay Chinese guys and gals, having a great old time, and I'm standing in the Guinness Anchor Berhad pub in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. But you know what? It was a fantastic night. They really enjoyed it, and they did their very best to make myself and Anne feel at home, and kept saying to me, oh, Ambassador, we always love going to the embassy. We wanted you to feel at home here tonight. Why they thought I'd feel at home in a Guinness brewery, I have no idea. Very well. So, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be glad to hear that I'm sort of coming to a conclusion. So what I've tried to do this evening is, and I thought about it very carefully, is give you some sense of what I say when I say that foreign policy is domestic policy. I haven't spoken at all about a lot of the other work in the department involving, of course, the aid side and UN, Northern Ireland, etc., etc. But my interest, frankly, has always been in recent years on the trade side. Our economy, our lifeblood of our economy is exports. And the disruption that I mentioned earlier on through Uber, et cetera, that is simply going to accelerate into the future. In fact, one of the last things I did before I left today was I just happened to see by chance, I wrote down here in my very efficient notes here, a book has been just put out by the McKinsey Global Institute and the London School of Economics, basically saying that there are going to be 4 massive disruptors impacting on all our lives as we go forward. Urbanisation, ageing, technology, and connectivity. And one of the things that I just looked at about a half an hour of this, it's on the web, it's fascinating, was the connectivity. And they made the point that Greece has been in default for 50% of the time since it left the Ottoman Empire. But it never impacted before, except on this occasion because it was connected to the rest of the European Union. So this connectivity may seem to be a great thing, but we simply have no idea how it's going to upend all of our lives going forward. The aging thing is truly scary, and I'm sure there's a lot more expertise in the room here than I have, but the numbers are staggering. So all of these little Chinese princes and princesses will now have 2 parents and 4 grandparents to look after going forward. So 1-to-6 ratio. How that's all going to impact and play out, nobody really knows. The scale of urbanisation in China is just simply phenomenal. I didn't catch the names of these cities, but they flashed on the screen about a half a dozen cities, which they asked something like 50 top American CEOs, had they ever heard of them in China, and the answer was no. Each one had more than 2 or 3 million people. So again, the scale of what's happening there is simply hard to take on board. And again, of course, technology, well, I've already mentioned that. So it seems to me that in a world like that, any country would want to be out there gaining as much intelligence as you can get. So truly, without a doubt, from now on, in the world where we live, foreign policy is very much domestic policy. Thank you very much.
You'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to say anything of consequence, but just to say that in my travels with on RCSI business, I've had the pleasure on a number of occasions of meeting Declan and Anne, and I would just echo what Hannah said earlier, that this college is truly indebted to Declan for the open way in which he made available to us his knowledge, his expertise, his networking. And I think we are doubly indebted to him after tonight's lecture, which was absolutely fantastic, and his personal insights and his anecdotes, I think, as someone said earlier, kept the audience enthralled. So Declan, it's my great pleasure to present you with the medal for the second Foley Lecture.